Bence.
Now, there's still no word on a cure for the virus.
Report suspicious activity and call 911.
I can give you every assurance, Mr. Rooney, that Gareth is alone and he's very good. They can't find him. All freaking full covers on
If it was anybody, it's the boss that passed us like 30 seconds ago. Tell this to the UFO.
We've all been weary after a long day's travel. Not quite feeling like ourselves when we deplane at our destination. Maybe you've landed in a place or a country you've never been, or perhaps even one that you've been to many times. No matter what, the feeling of being tired and just wanting to get to your destination as soon as you can, I think is universal for all travelers. Sometimes airport security can seem overbearing or customs officials even intimidating, but they serve an important purpose in all of our safety. But what if when you arrived and presented your identification or passport, you were met with a blank expression of mystery and intrigue? What if the airport customs official had never heard of where you just came from? A place that you'd been traveling from successfully without any issues all of your life. What if you found out you just flew from a place that they're telling you doesn't exist? The place you call home. On a scorching hot summer's day in July 1954, a passenger airline touched down at Haneda Airport in Tokyo, Japan. It was late afternoon, the sun still high in the sky and beaming down as the passengers disembarked, the heat waves shimmering across the tarmac. They were mostly Japanese, perhaps returning from a vacation or visiting other parts of the world, but there were several European travelers as well. Nothing in particular that would have stood out as strange to any of the fellow airport travelers or even the Japanese customs officials. To them even, it was probably just another normal day at the office. However, one passenger did catch their attention. A slender, well-dressed European man with a slight beard, carrying a nice leather briefcase along with his luggage, stepped up next at the customs counter. The customs official took his normal-looking and appropriately worn passport. The man's primary language was French, although he spoke Japanese very well as several other languages. When asked, he told the officials in Japanese that he was there on business. They, of course, had zero reason to disbelieve him. He didn't appear to be a tourist. As the customs official looked down at his passport, that's when things took a bizarre turn. The passport had several travel stamps from several different nations, including Japan. There was nothing about the passport that looked fake or counterfeit. What stood out and struck the official as odd, however, was his country of origin. Emblazoned on his passport in bold lettering was the name Taured. The official, nor his nearby officials whom he called over, recognized this name. They didn't doubt, however, the authenticity or validity of the passport. They did pull him aside for clarification and to allow the building customs line to keep moving. They then asked the man to follow them into a small side office used for interviews not unlike this one, so they could begin further questioning and clarification. The man, who was polite, cooperated willingly. They asked him for other forms of identification, which he happily obliged and calmly handed over, showing that he was, in fact, a citizen of a country named Taured.
I'm telling you the truth. I don't know why you don't believe me.
He also presented currency and banknotes issued by his homeland, which again didn't look counterfeit at all. Confused but completely intrigued and curious, the Japanese customs officials placed a map of the world on the table. They slid it over to the man and asked him to point out where his country was located. He smugly agreed, smiling, no doubt beginning to get slightly frustrated at the charade the officials were putting him through. Pulling the map closer to himself so he could quickly show them, his smug expression changed immediately to one of confusion
This is impossible.
and then shock.
It's not here.
He pointed to an area right on the border between France and Spain, where the modern-day Principality of Andorra is currently, saying that this is where his homeland should have been.
I don't understand.
In a confused, somewhat frantic voice, he declared that the kingdom of Taured was over 1,000 years old, and that there was no reason it wouldn't be on any standard world map.
It should be on any map.
He also claimed this was his third trip to Japan that year. He'd made similar trips over the past 5 years and had never encountered any problems at customs before. He again pointed to the country stamps on his passport as evidence of these trips. Beginning to get frustrated, he asked the officials to call the company he was visiting, or to call the hotel where he had a reservation, or even to call his company who could verify who he was. The officials, also becoming equally agitated, called the company he claimed he was visiting, who said that they had never heard of him. Looking up the company he worked for, they discovered didn't exist. And calling the hotel where he had made a reservation, they couldn't find under his name. At this point, his confusion and perhaps even amusement had quickly turned to anger. He began accusing the staff of pulling an elaborate joke at his expense. He then demanded to see government officials immediately so they could clear the matter up and he could be on his way. Since they couldn't detain him indefinitely in this small office, they agreed to let him stay at the airport hotel on one of the top floors while he waited for the government officials and authorities to arrive. 2 guards were placed outside the door of the room under strict orders to not let the man leave under any circumstances. He was served a meal and reportedly took a nap. But when the government officials arrived later that evening, they knocked on his door and found there was no response. Asking the guards to open the room, upon entering, the man from Taured and all his belongings had vanished without a trace. The guards, of course, were strongly questioned, and they maintained that no one had come in or out the room except room service for the meal. They had never left their post, and the only other exit was from a sealed, ledgeless window that was 6 floors above the road below. The fall alone would have killed anyone that attempted that jump, not to mention broken the window glass and left shards of evidence behind. Although obviously baffled by this entire encounter, no one, including the authorities, ever saw this man again. Who was this man from Taured? How did he possibly vanish from a duly guarded room on the 6th floor of a hotel? One theory is that he was an unwitting interdimensional traveler who came from a reality not too unlike our own, with, of course, at least one obvious difference: his homeland of Taured. When he awoke from his nap, did he wake up back in his dimension of origin? In another hotel room? Confused that perhaps it was all just a dream? Did he then spend the rest of his life wondering about that vivid dream, never quite sure if it had ever actually happened? Maybe he ended up reporting his experience in his universe. Perhaps the legend even being told right now on a podcast, much like this one.
Hey kids, welcome back to That Would Be Rad, the podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in pre-internet mysteries, retro video games, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. I'm your host, Tyler Bence, and this is your other host, Woody Brown. Wow, what a story.
Man, just insane. Like when you said that you thought this should be our next episode, I never heard anything about this man, the Man From Taured. I mean, literally seconds after diving into it a little bit, I was hooked. I could not wait to tell this story. I couldn't wait for people to hear more about it.
Totally. It is, it's a funny thing because apparently the story kind of comes from the 60s. I think that was when it kind of started making its rounds as sort of like an urban legend. And I think there were a couple articles in some Japanese newspapers about it. Yeah, it's just kind of been one of those really kind of off the beaten path urban legends that I think it's so fascinating and it's so cool.
Dude, I love how there's so many obscure legends like this that, you know, myself as an example, I'd never heard about, but then they're just so fascinating that you're like, oh man, it's like opening up this like world of just mystique and intrigue that it's just super exciting.
Yeah, for sure. It as a fan of the paranormal and fringe science and, you know, anything kind of weird, you know, it's like anytime you hear these little stories, these sort of one-off stories, like these urban legends, or it just sort of makes the world more interesting. It's like, well, it opens the world up for potential and possibilities. And I think that's just so cool.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of room for, you know, when a story like this is told, when someone hears a story like this, the immediate potential reaction, of course, of anyone that would be even just slightly skeptical about... Skeptical. You know, anybody that's just slightly skeptical when they hear a story like this, it's fascinating to me because, well, you know, I mean, first off, I understand the reaction, right? I mean, most of the people, my wife included, and certainly probably leading the charge, her kind of approach to anything like this or anything even paranormal is there's got to be, you know, a valid sort of explanation for what just happened. What's cool about stuff like this is, in a way, there kind of is. You know, there are physicists and there is science and at least thought experiments behind a lot of the things that this specific legend, kind of things that happen in this specific story, you know? Like, well, you know, okay. I've always been a fan and fascinated with the concept of like time travel. In some ways, I think that maybe even some of the things that are reported as, you know, UFOs or aliens could in fact be visitors from, you know, the far distant future. And reading things like
Back to the Future.
Yeah. Well, Back to the Future definitely kind of sparked my interest in time travel. But, you know, like in college and stuff, I read A Brief History in Time. And just the idea that there is science beyond sort of what you learn in grade school, and that very acclaimed, very well-respected people within the scientific community don't, and that's the beauty of science, they don't hold it as an impossibility. They acknowledge things like this happening as a possibility, and then have, you know, hypothesized and even theorized how it could be possible. And that's when it gets really fun and interesting for me. You know, there's a guy, Erwin
Schrodinger's cat, that theory.
Yeah, man. So basically the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment is like this. The hypothesis is that throughout a person's life, they're going to have many, if not infinite, choices to be made throughout a person's life, right? Which could lead to millions, if not infinite numbers of outcomes. And so each time someone makes a choice and comes to this kind of like crossroads, the theory is that the universe splits into several possible branches based upon the different decisions available to that individual at that moment in time. And then that these kind of branches go on to coexist as separate space-times. And so given like the number of life forms on planet Earth, for example, I mean, I'm talking about, you know, dogs, cats, humans, whatever, every single organism almost is faced with all these infinite choices. So there's all these sort of infinite alternate existences, basically, based on all of those infinite possibilities that are kind of just coexisting, essentially. Now, anybody listening to this that is like super skeptic, I get it. That sounds a little
Well,
Marvel,
but I mean,
because I mean, really, the term later coined was like the multiverse, and
Right.
Comic fans or anybody that just happened to get into the Marvel franchise or anything like that can kind of start to understand the multiverse idea. But if you think about it, if you just kind of like come along for the ride and just think about it in terms of the thought experiment, meaning just kind of thinking through that is just fascinating. I mean, think about all the different choices that you made. When I say you, I mean anyone listening to this, of course, but also you, Tyler, that you made just this morning, for example.
Oh, yeah.
The 5 seconds that it took you to maybe be late to go to an appointment, or
which I was.
yeah, well, of course,
I had a neurologist appointment, and I was indeed late.
and maybe that being late was a good thing because of any of the infinite possibilities that could have occurred if you had been on time or whatever. And so just that like idea is fascinating. And I think because of that idea, because of the idea that there are multiverses and there's all these infinite possibilities that existed and all the different outcomes kind of just coexisting, and us not really knowing like how far apart those outcomes or universes, if you will, are from each other. Like the distance between those different universes could be extremely small, or they could be millions of light years away in terms of distance. Okay.
Well, and they say too, this sort of plays into like the butterfly effect, where say in this reality we went to the store and met a friend, and then in the next reality that never happened. Well, maybe that leads to you never meeting your wife. Maybe that leads to, so it's these like little things that could possibly send shockwaves through your basically your destiny. So it's a really interesting thing, and I'm super glad that you didn't really stick on the, I don't know, I think it's easy to get stuck on like the nuts and bolts time travel aspect of this. And the older I've gotten, I think that it has more to do with these sort of multiple realities. So it's like if you look to your right, every, beside you, there's an endless array of Tylers doing all slightly different things. So I think with these, it's a little bit of like bleed over into realities where it's super interesting because, what happened with this guy? Because he disappeared from his room. So did he sort of merge with our reality, or the reality as back then as we knew it, and then he was here one night and then he merged back into his, and maybe Taured was right back where it was supposed to be. He got on the plane, went back, and everything was cool. And there's multiple stories like this, where somebody sort of just appears out of nowhere. There's like one in New York. I remember a long time ago hearing about the story, and I couldn't find it, but I looked it up yesterday, and basically it was a guy just sort of appeared at an intersection back in, I want to say like the 60s maybe, popped in the middle of an intersection in the middle of New York, got hit by a car, died. Well, then there's a guy that disappeared, and they never knew like what happened to him. And basically he had the same contents in his pocket as the guy that appeared at the intersection and was killed in New York years prior. He had the same like coat check from this men's club that he was a member of. He had the same clothing, and so it's sort of this for me too. It gets into like and again, like what he said, there's so many people out there that know so much more than we do about this topic that really get into like the science of it. But it gets into a thing called retrocausality, which is pretty fascinating. It's basically looking at time as like it's not a linear thing. There's a professor at a Ivy League school. I can't remember if it was Harvard or Princeton or wherever, but the professor would every semester, and he did this for several years in a row, he would do these pop quizzes all throughout the semester with his kids every year. And half of those pop quizzes, he would spring out of nowhere. They would take the pop quiz. That was it. The other the other 50% of the pop quizzes, he would do the pop quiz, and then he would go over all of the answers and explain, like, how they reached, the answer that they were supposed to get. Almost 99% of the time, those pop quizzes the kids ended up doing exponentially better. So by them studying after they took the test, was that like somehow informing the answers that they were giving before? It's looking at time as sort of this jumbled kind of thing instead of this linear. Here's the beginning, here's the end.
So hold on, I'm a little confused. I'm a little confused here. So basically, the professor, half the time he would give a pop quiz, and then the other half of the time he would give a pop quiz, but then would kind of go over the answers
Afterwards.
with the class.
The grades were like 99% better. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Now, I'm wondering too, because I know this sometimes would happen at my university, where he would do that for one class, and then not he, as in I didn't have him, obviously, but like a professor would do that.
You went
kind
to
of
an
thing.
Ivy League school.
I went to like a kudzu league school. A professor would basically go over the quiz in the 8 o'clock class. By the time you took the class at like 1, your buddy already knew all the answers because he wrote the notes down, and so you're studying those notes. You come in at 1, boom, pow, boom. You get the good grade.
No, he had like because he was doing it this way, he had like a baseline of every single time he would do it, it would be completely sort of sporadic. And then also, it's not like he would spring the same, test on the
Different
students
stuff.
a week
Yeah.
later, and he would do it on like another class. So it was completely sporadic.
Cool, yeah. Because another way that we used to kind of get by all that too was, you just write the notes in your TI-85.
I don't know what that is.
The calculator? You don't know the TI-85 calculator? You don't remember that from like high school? The big...
What's a calculator?
Oh my God. I can't believe
I went to a small private school.
Jesus, man, no kidding. You seriously don't know what a TI-85 is?
I never no.
Oh,
Well, you
man.
got to look at this though. I was a really smart kid. I was in a lot of gifted classes, but math, I was about as remedial as it gets.
Hey, man, you just got to
even
own
out.
it, you know?
Tonight's program has been brought to you by...
I kind of want to like loop back to the Man From Taured. There's a couple things that whenever I was reading about it and thinking about it and stuff, there's a couple of moments that I kind of want to like really have people think about. And one of them is like, can you imagine how absolutely terrifying it would be if you were in any of the roles that happened in this story? Like if you were the man from Taured or woman, and all of a sudden, just right out of the gate, you'd be like, these people are playing a joke on me.
Oh, yeah.
And anytime you travel internationally, the stress is, I think, increasingly so since like, September 11th, 2001. But like the stress level on an international trip can sometimes be sort of off the charts because when you get off the plane, wait, what do I have to declare? What is this form that I have to fill out? Customs officials are sometimes intense. So your stress is already, off the charts. And then these people, I can't even fathom what it would be like when someone would say,
What's America?
yeah, what is America?
Yeah.
You'd be like, okay, come on, man. That's funny. I need to go,
Yeah.
And then them being so serious, right? And because practical jokers, they do it pretty well. Look at old Punked or whatever, right?
Well, this was also back in, what was the year?
Pre-Ashton. 1954.
Yeah, 54. That wasn't really a common, big practical jokes like that. I don't think that was a common thing. And I feel like
Especially not in
also-
the Japanese culture.
Right, exactly. Well, and also, the fact that it got so far to the point of, oh, by the way, we're going to detain you for a night. So not only is he already late, I'm sure he was super frustrated. We've never heard of your country.
Furious, yeah.
And then now we're going to keep you overnight. It's just, that's insane. I love the fact that he shows proof of his passport and he speaks like another language. I think you said he spoke multiple languages, but it would be like Japanese, but then different.
Yeah, it's just it's wild, man. And then imagine how like frustrating it would be if you were one of the officers or something like that. You know, you've got this in your mind, absolute crazy person telling you that they're from this country that doesn't exist. Of course, the first thing in your mind is like, what is this guy? Like, this guy's on drugs. I mean, what is he doing? You know,
Yeah.
the details about how the passport, it didn't look counterfeit, but it was also like worn down like a passport would be. And it had the stamps of different countries in there, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, man alive, it's just crazy.
Well, also, I think it's funny to think about the, you know, the guys. I mean, it went like the dudes that worked at the airport. It's like, we don't know what to do either. So here's a globe. Point
show
to
us.
where your country is. And he's like, oh, it's not here. That's crazy.
Oh, God.
So
Yeah, I know.
crazy.
And, you know, like, I think, so, okay, in terms of what we think happened, do you want to give your theory first, or do you want to hear my idea?
I mean, I kind of gave mine in the sense that I think that it was, you know, I don't think it's a time thing. I think it was like a sort of maybe a merging of two realities, and maybe it sort of, you know, intertwined and then self-corrected, and then he disappeared back to, you know, his reality or somewhere else.
Almost like when you say like intertwine, do you mean like there's sort of like some sort of rift in whatever keeps all these realities separated, right? And so there's
Right.
some sort of like way that people from one area can suddenly be in the next. And I think too, here's what's helped me with kind of thinking about all this. When people think of alternate realities or multiple universes, and they think, well, I mean, it would be different enough that like I would know that, you know, I was somewhere else. But what if, you know, because of all the small choices, what if there's really not that noticeable of a difference? If I was in my office, I was looking at like the couch that's in there, you know, someone might say, well, I mean, there's no difference there. Well, what if it was just like the color was slightly different or
Well,
different? theme,
that's
you know?
where the Mandela effect comes in. Where it's like these little things, like, you know, if you build it, he will come now. It's no longer mirror, mirror on the wall. It's magic mirror on the wall. It's, you know, no longer life is like a box of chocolates. It's life was like a box of chocolates. So it's these little tiny things that are kind of changing. So we'll go back into the Mandela effect and do like a real deep dive, probably a multi-episode one, because there's so many just amazing examples. But what's happening there? Because I would venture to say every person out there remembers Berenstain Bears, EIN Bears, instead of now it's Berenstain, STAIN, like a stain on the carpet. Or like, you know, the Publishers Clearinghouse. Every person that I've asked this has said immediately, oh, it was Ed McMahon. Ed McMahon never worked for the Publishers Clearinghouse. He never held a big check on a commercial. And what is that? Why does everybody say, well, this is how I remember it?
Yeah.
So
Well, and
what is,
we've kind of thought about this too. Like, I'm a terrible person for you to ask those questions because
know.
around that time, like around elementary and middle school, I lived overseas where they would just change stuff anyway. So like Encino Man was called California Man,
Oh,
you know,
I
because
love
they
it.
had to like relate. Like nobody knows what Encino is in Jakarta, Indonesia, right? So
Right.
in Southeast Asia, no one's like, oh, cool, I'll go see a movie called Encino Man. They don't know what that is. So the California Man, or like, I sent you a picture of those Happy Toes instead of Doritos.
that's amazing.
So you asked me a question. I'm like, I don't know, man. You know, I had bootleg copies of tapes and stuff that they would change ever so slightly so that they wouldn't be like sued and stuff. I mean, you know, so I'm a terrible resource for that.
Did you go into what you thought it was?
Oh no, I didn't. Yeah. So in some ways, I'm a little skeptical. Like the Mandela effect is probably an example of one of the things where I'm like, I feel like
Don't you do it?
No, I'm just saying, I feel like there's, for some of those things, explanations or some sort of psychological effects that you can have on you know, in terms of memory and stuff. So that, for example, I'm probably the most skeptical about, believe it or not. But, you know, do aliens exist? I think they could. Mandela effect? I don't know. Yeah, well, I'm just saying. For this, though, I do like the concept. Well, I say like. I mean, if it happened to me, I'd be mortifying. I mean, it would be just the idea of waking up in a different reality and things being different, especially now as like a dad and a husband. And that's terrifying. But it's entertaining and it's fun to kind of think about, as long as it didn't happen to me. I think, because all of the small choices can potentially make a new sort of reality, so to speak, a different thread. Yeah, the probability of sort of the distance between those realities, or the whatever it is that separates us from that reality. Man, sometimes maybe they do kind of just, I mean, I just think probability wise, there's a probability, if you kind of follow that line of thinking, that there is a probability that those realities or several realities could overlap. And that's fascinating. So in this case specifically, I think for whatever reason, those realities overlapped. Maybe it happened when he was on the plane. And, I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe there's something to it. Did he fall asleep on the plane? Does dreaming have anything to do with it? Since he have said to take a nap at the thing, maybe there's some sort of tie in there with dreams. I mean, dreams fascinate me like crazy. The fact that our mind can create this movie that you're living in,
Yeah.
and it's so vivid and real. And when you wake up sometimes, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but have you ever had like one of those dreams where, you're mad at your wife for something, and you wake up and you're like, you kind of think that that's real, and so you're still pissed off in the morning?
Oh yeah.
I remember a long time ago.
I'm pretty sure she has those dreams about me
constantly,
every night.
Daydreams. She's
Yep.
daydreaming it right now.
Yep.
I mean, I would be. I'm on Team Courtney all day.
100%.
Somebody told me a long time ago that, and I don't know if this is from a book. If so, we got to find it. And it's an episode on its own about dreams. But essentially, when you dream, your soul or whatever, or your consciousness goes to this other sort of plane of existence along with other people that happen to be, for example, dreaming at that time. That's part of the way that you can explain, like, if you've had a dream about someone that you've never met in real life, but they're like a real person,
Right. Yeah.
because that's a real person. They're also on the quote unquote dream plane. Plane as in plane of existence, not like airplane. It's just an interesting concept. So I think, in short, what do I think happened here? I think possibly there was some sort of overlapping of realities. And this guy, his reality is he comes from a place called Taured, and he just happened to kind of overlap into our reality, and then kind of went back. And like I said, imagine if he reported that, or if he thinks about that constantly. I mean, 1954, let's say he's in mid-30s.
Well, he's probably
dead. Yeah. But, he told his offspring about it if he had him, and or his wife or partner or whatever. Like, someone else in that reality has heard this strange tale in a different way. I like that idea about it somehow being tied to dreams.
One thing that I had actually never thought of until you just said this, but as I've gotten older, I've sort of prescribed sort of this theory and like sort of multiverses and sort of merging or overlapping or bleed through of realities. That's why haunted houses or ghost sightings, or I'm not saying that they're not wandering spirits or they're not sort of a replaying of events, but I think a lot of this could explain sort of the haunting ideas where, and also, like you go, oh, this house is haunted. Maybe it's not the house. Maybe it's just that's where our reality is a little thinner. So you're able to sort of see beyond into like another reality, or, like hot spots or portals, or, I mean, I know it gets a little crazy, but I like the idea that you just brought up where you said, well, maybe he sort of shifted into another reality as he was flying. I mean, when I was a kid, I always thought, oh, well, the Bermuda Triangle is, it's like a portal, and I mean, there's several things. I mean, I think Amelia Earhart even went through a weird, what do they call it? They called it like like electronic fog or something where they can't really see anything out of the cockpit, and then they arrive 2 hours ahead of time, or there's 20 hours missing and there's no way that they would have had enough gas in their plane that they were flying around for actual 20 hours.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's really cool. So, I mean, who knows, that could have even played into it. I mean, maybe somewhere in the sky, there was another hot spot that, that plane sort of flew in, and maybe everybody else on that plane was from other countries that were included in the reality that, where the airport and all that stuff was. Not to go off on a rabbit trail, but the way that I found out about
Is that
this,
the saying? I'm trying. Is that what it's? Is that right?
yeah,
Again,
I
I'm
don't know.
a terrible judge of that because
I mean, maybe in your reality,
in
a
my reality,
rabbit
I don't know if it's
trail-
like not to go down a rabbit trail. I guess that's
what it's
probably right.
called.
Rabbit hole.
No, that sounds even worse.
Yeah, but okay. Like I don't know if I believe you, but go ahead. Rabbit trail.
Anyway, the reason I found out about this, so I don't really consider myself somebody who has had a lot of experiences, but it's funny because I was talking to a friend of mine, Tim Renner, the host of Strange Familiars podcast. I was actually on an episode and talking about this. So I've had several sort of, I guess you would look at as like paranormal events throughout my life, and a couple we're going to go into on Halloween, but I'm going to tell one today that, after this event happened is when I just started binging and started researching, time slips and alternate realities and, everything. So I had a situation kind of like this myself. Several years ago, I used to work at a hospital, and I used to work in the OR, and I was an operating room assistant. So basically they would call on our radios, room 22 is turning over. That meant they've already done the surgery, and we would show up to move the patient on, from the operating table onto the stretcher, and then we would wheel them into recovery. There was one day where I came in at 11, so my lunch was like at 3 o'clock or something, and I text my wife, Courtney, after lunch as I was heading back on the floor. I said, hey, I'll call you whenever I get back. They've just called for turnover and, in a room or whatever. So
For anybody that hasn't worked at a hospital before and would not be familiar with the word turnover.
Sorry. Yeah, turnover is when, like I was saying, like when a room is, when they're done with the surgery and we're coming in, we're moving the patient onto the stretcher, we're wheeling them out, we're cleaning up, setting everything up for the next case.
Got it.
And so in this operating room, I mean, it's pretty huge. It was just the operating floor was about as big as a football field. So, on one side of the hall, it's all even numbers. On the other side, it's all odd numbers. So, like I said, I just had lunch. I text my wife, hey, I'll call you or I'll text you when I get out of this room. Say it was 4 o'clock. I showed up in the room. And also, just to know, we kept like a radio or like a walkie-talkie, like in my breast pocket. And so anytime we would turn over a room, two of us would have to go. So, I went on the radio, said, this is Tyler, copy room, 22. I'll be there in a second. And then my buddy Ernie, he was an older guy, he copied too. So I knew it was going to be the two of us. So we showed up. He's on the way we would move the patient is basically he's on the side of the stretcher. I'm on the side of the operating table. And we would do like a count off, and there was like a little roller board thing. We would count off, and he would pull the patient over onto the bed, and I would sort of wheel the patient over, and then I would pull the stretcher, the side rail up, and then we would wheel them out. Well, we show up to room 22. The last thing that I remember, and keep in mind, this is like you have to have like two guys. So I remember hearing somebody say, moving and turnover in room, something. I don't remember what it was. And that was the last thing I remember. Next thing I know is I show up in another room with a thing called a beanbag. It's just like sort of, it's a term for like this thing that you would hook an air hose up to, and it would, it's hard to explain, but it's basically this piece of machinery that we would use in the operating room. I showed up to a certain room and I was like, "Hey, here's your beanbag," and they were like, "We didn't call for a beanbag," and I'm like, "What?" And I was like, "Okay, well, sorry," and then I walk out. Well, then I see Ernie, and he is pissed, and I was like, "Hey, man, what's going on?" And I was like, "Hey, who needed the beanbag?" And he was like, "I don't even know what you're talking about. Nobody called for a beanbag." And I was like, "What's wrong with you, man?" And he said, "You just left me hanging." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "We were in room 22 and the radio went off, called for something." And he said, "You basically looked up, looked at the door, and just walked off." And he said, "We had to have 2 nurses fill in for you. And even the doctor, as you were walking out of the room, was like, 'Hey, where are you going?'" And
What?
he said, I looked at the door, I walked straight out, and everybody's calling for me, and I just walked straight out the door. So,
Jeez, dude, like with like just a blank expression.
blank expression. I didn't even respond when the doctor, Ernie, and like I think even a nurse was saying, "Hey, Tyler, we need you. We need an ORA to help." And so here's what's weird. So it's like this is not registering what Ernie's telling me, and he's saying, basically. So I'm like, okay, I need to know exactly what happened because I came in to turn over with you, and then I remember hearing something on the radio, and then that's the last thing I remember. And he said, "Yeah, the radio went off, and it was like static." He said that he didn't even know if anybody called out. That he just thought it was like static because sometimes
Squawk, like a.
yeah, sometimes somebody would hit the button and then they were going to ask a question, then they would realize, "Oh, well, I don't need that," so then they'd cut it off. And he said, "I don't even think anybody called you, but the second that happened, it's like you looked up, you dropped the rollerboard, you had your hands on the rollerboard, you like let go, and then you walked straight for the door and just left." So what was really weird about it, and this is where it like kind of started freaking me out a little bit, is I looked at my clock, and remember how I said I had just got back from lunch and it would have been 4:00. Well, now it was like 5:45. And another thing that was weird is when I
Wait a
sort
minute,
of
whoa. So before this happened, it was like lunchtime, or I mean your meal break, which is
Right.
like what, 3 p.m.
yeah, it would have been like 3:20 or
3
something.
p.m. or something.
And I took like a 40-minute break, so it would have been 4:00 when I got on the floor as I was coming back from lunch.
And
room
heard
22
what you
called out.
remember hearing. Hey, we need a beanbag.
Well, no. So I heard no. So I got back from lunch, and then as I'm coming back on the floor for my lunch break, I hear room 22 moving and turnover. So then I answer, and then we show up at the room, and then I don't remember anything after I heard my radio call out. All I remember is it's an hour and 45 minutes, roughly an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes later, and I'm holding a beanbag, asking
In a room
like,
that doesn't need one.
yeah.
So
And
you're like,
I'm like,
not only are you just like, you didn't just like black out in the room that it happened. You just like are in another place.
completely
just
in
being
another
like,
place. And what's
Oh,
weird
gosh.
too is like I said, the operating floor is as big as a football field. So another interesting point is that from room 22, where I would have gotten the beanbag would have been, I would have had to go completely all the way around to the opposite side of like the odd side. So I was on the even side, and this would have been in the odd side where, like the closet, like where we would keep all these supplies.
Yeah. So basically the other side of the building.
Right, exactly. And so that shows that I didn't blank out. I didn't just fall asleep somewhere.
Yeah.
It means that whatever happened, when this radio went off, I showed up completely across the floor with a piece of machinery that nobody called out for, and it's an hour 30, hour 45 minutes after.
Man, that is crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, thank goodness you weren't just like holding some kind of like, I don't know, operating saw or something.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Have that call. So like when you explain this to Ernie, Ernesto, did
We did actually call him Ernesto.
so he's mad at you. You're like, what? Like, what
Yeah.
happens next? Do you kind of like explain, like, dude, I don't know what just happened, man. Like, 1 second I was there, now I'm here, and like, I don't know what you're talking about. Do you calm them down, or do you just like, what happened? Like,
Well, I not originally, because I mean it really took me a minute to realize, like, wait a minute, this isn't adding up, because whatever happened in between, I was perfectly under the impression that I was just doing my job. I was just going along with normal daily activities, and then somebody called out for this beanbag, which apparently didn't happen either. So whatever I was doing, I was just like continuing on. So another interesting part is that, like, I considered myself a really good employee. Like, I was always on the ball, always anywhere that anybody needed me. But there were a few guys there that, they'd kind of go missing for an hour, or they'd hop off the floor to go towards the lab and hang out with their girlfriend on another level, or because basically we have like tasks that we were doing throughout the day, but then while like in between surgeries, we were just kind of waiting sometimes on a room to call out, and then then we would copy, and then we would go. So there were a lot of guys that, or not a lot, but there were a few guys that would just kind of be a little lazy. Yeah. And so that was one of the things, because Ernie was actually a really good friend of mine, and him and I were both like pretty hard workers. So I would always have his back, and he would always have mine. And so it was really weird for me to see him, like, I mean, genuinely like pretty pissed off, because,
and rightfully so. I mean, if you look at it from his perspective
absolutely.
too, it's like, dude, what in the world? This guy just like literally walked out. And
well, and that was another thing, is he said that basically all that stuff happened, and then I just disappeared. And I even went around after that, once I figured out, like, wait a minute, I'm missing like over an hour and a half of time that I don't know anything that just happened. Like, I don't know. And so I went around to ask, like, hey, I know this is going to sound weird, but to the other ORAs, hey, have you seen me in the last hour and a half? And like, everybody said, no, I was nowhere to be seen. I didn't answer any radios. Nobody saw me like turning over any rooms. And that was another thing. It was actually like a pretty busy time of the day too. So it looked like I just up and disappeared.
jeez, man.
Yeah, really weird. The only thing that I thought of, after this happened, there was an event when I was a kid where, we grew up in the country, up in Cleveland, Georgia. I got off the bus, and I would always go to my grandparents' house. It was like a dirt road from my grandparents' house up to my house. I don't know. How far would you say that is?
From your house to your grandparents' house?
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm terrible
man.
with like distance, but like
maybe like
kilometer.
no, man, like
No?
let's see, maybe like 100 yards. I mean, like a football field,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So about like the length of a football field. And so when I was a kid, my grandpa had horses and cattle and stuff, and we had horses on, like, in between. There was like a fence along the path along the dirt road between my house and my grandparents' house. So I got off the bus. This would have been around 3:30ish. I went to my grandmother's house, got a snack, and then I came home to like do homework. I would have been in like, I don't know, 3rd, 4th grade, maybe 5th grade, maybe at the latest. I remember walking home, along the dirt road, and then it was like time skipped, and then next thing I know, I'm laying on the ground and I'm getting up, and it's almost dark, which would mean that basically from 3:30 until, I don't know, a couple hours.
Depending on what time of year. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I can't remember, but
Definitely several hours, if not
several
like
hours
more.
Yeah. And so I always just thought, I'm a kid. Maybe I touched, because I remember at one time there was an electric fence. Maybe I touched an electric fence.
There's a bare wire, that.
Well, no, I mean,
happened to,
we
like,
had cattle and
bite down
and
on
horses and stuff. I just always sort of chalked it up to maybe I touched the electric fence. Maybe I got bucked by a horse, even though I didn't have a mark on me. But it was really weird, because as soon as this happened at the hospital, it was one of the first things that immediately popped in my head, and I was like, I feel like this is
Weird, man.
something in the same you know.
Yikes, man! That's just crazy, dude. I've had some crazy experiences that I can't wait to kind of dive into on
Oh,
the
yeah.
show, but I haven't had that, and so that's, oh man, that's so crazy. Well, I mean, I don't know if you want to get into this on the podcast, but just out of my own curiosity, was this, and I'm not trying to explain away what happened, but was this in or around the time that, especially since you just literally, I mean, coincidentally, how crazy is this, that you just came from a neurologist appointment? Was this around the time before, or,
Oh, yeah.
like that you started having, like the extreme headaches and them discovering that you had like a tumor?
Yeah, I totally had forgotten about that. But yeah, I had never been a person who had ever gotten headaches, my whole life. Like I know a lot of people who, they constantly have headaches, and
And migraines and stuff too, right?
Well, I'd never had a migraine up until that point. I'd probably even just regular headaches, I'd probably had, maybe 10 my whole life or something. But yeah, right around, that's really interesting that you said that, because right around that time, I think I had my first migraine, and, my wife is like super, anything that like happens to me, or, like she would have me going and do checkups twice a year, and she would call the doctor for me and set up an appointment, and then be like, hey, he's complaining about he has an irregular heartbeat, so you may want to put him on a Holter monitor. He's also complaining about some headaches, so let's go ahead and get an MRI going. So she wants me to do every possible test I can, and I did. I ended up having my first couple migraines, shortly after that, and went in, did the MRI. Everything was fine. And then probably about a year later, I started having like these headaches, and my migraines has gotten really, really bad. So I went in for another MRI, and this would have been only a year later. And it went from absolutely nothing out of the ordinary to I had a tumor pushing on my frontal lobe that was as big as a $50. And it was actually fortunately they were able to remove it by going, up my nasal cavity, and, they didn't have to shave my head and stuff. But it is weird, because when they went in, it had, metastasized, or was so accelerated in the growth that from even whenever they did the MRI to like the month after, it was growing so fast and had gotten so big that it was like starting to like crack the front of my skull.
Oh my god!
Even because it was just, there's no room, and it's pushing on my frontal lobe. So, who knows what other weird side effects from that, but super weird. Like I would taste like metal. I would smell, weird smells that nobody else would, when the tumor was like pressing on my frontal lobe or whatever. But yeah, it I don't know if it's
And
a
again,
correlation.
I'm not trying to explain away
No, I was definitely
what you experienced, but it's like,
abducted by aliens.
But for real, it kind of makes it easier to not explain away that, you went for the MRI and they didn't see anything. But things like that can have an effect on someone's perceived reality. Maybe, we could just go into so many different like crazy theories. Like maybe you did go into
Another reality.
And the byproduct of when that happens to someone, for example, the Man From Taured, is maybe they come back with some damage to the brain,
Yeah.
Who knows, right? It's just there's endless possibilities. I was thinking while you were talking,
Rambling.
No, I was thinking, have I had an experience like that? And there is actually, there is one, man. So whenever I was in college, man, up in Dahlonega, one night I was at this like party and having fun and everything, and it was kind of like one of those nights where I was like, I just feel like going home or whatever. Next thing I know, I'm like waking up in my apartment, and I'm like, oh man, lights coming through the curtains, and I'm like, what's going on? And I look out my window, and my window faced the parking lot of the apartment complex. And I look, and my truck is parked like not in the space, which is sort of perpendicular to the apartment building, but like parallel to so sideways. Imagine somebody just going and whipping it in right in front of a door. Turns out
you got roofied, bro.
Yeah, turns out that someone did drive me home. They parked my truck like that as a prank, and that the only reason I didn't remember was because I had too much to drink. Anyway, hey. Oh man, that one's not going to make it in. But I just think it's so fascinating. You know, I think it leaves room for skeptics and quote unquote believers alike. And there's just been so many kind of accounts of people who either claim to have traveled to and visited an alternate reality or claim to be someone who has arrived from an alternate reality. Right. So it's not just the Man From Taured. This isn't the only situation or event like this. There are more of those out there. You know, I know I found like a couple, and you were kind of talking about a couple, you know, earlier. You know, two of the examples that I found were, one was in 1972, these four girls were kind of traveling together across the Utah and Nevada state line. And they ended up crashing their car into like a creek bed. And obviously, you know, when that happens, especially in 1972, the cops come out and they say, hey, you know, what have you girls been up to? Have you been drinking, taking drugs? They're like, no. They then described to the law enforcement officers that they basically, out of nowhere, they were driving along, and then all of a sudden they were driving through this like terrifying, what they described as like otherworldly landscape being chased by these humanoid beings.
Yeah, they like came out
like,
of the woods, right?
Yeah, and driving like egg-shaped vehicles and chasing them down, and they try to avoid them, and then boom, they crash in this creek bed. Here's another part of this. It's just like crazy, man. So the cops, of course, are like, man, these girls have been smoking that old herbal jazz cigarettes, haven't you? And well, and they're from, I love how like it doesn't matter if they're from Nevada or Utah or Alabama.
Country.
My yeah, I immediately go to like the country cop. Anyway.
It sounds like my grandpa.
Yeah. I guess the evidence that they found in terms of like the tire marks and stuff on the road, there's like a big sort of gap. The way that they crashed into the creek bed, the tire tracks would have been a certain way and would have been like longer or something like that. When they looked at it, it looked like they just braked at the last second. In other words, kind of implying that they may have been driving on in a completely different area, and then all of a sudden, boop, they're here in the creek bed, and oh man, you know, like you would how you would react last minute if all of a sudden a creek bed just appeared, and you're like, oh,
right,
you know, and then jammed on the brakes, and then boom.
Like if a squirrel jumps out in front of you.
I don't brake for squirrels, bro.
Okay, if a dog jumps out in front of you.
Kind of like that, yeah.
Horse.
Yeah, of course, man. I mean, anything. I mean, I try to avoid squirrels, and we're going off the rails.
Jeez.
And I've got to edit this out
every time.
You know, so that one was fascinating. There was also,
I mean, especially the egg-shaped vehicles.
And humanoid
That's amazing.
beings. Yeah, man. And then, so that was 1972. Most recently, the one that I found was this lady in 2008. She appeared on this like forum. You know, I don't know if it was Reddit or whatever, but I don't even know if it was social media. I don't know if she just like made a Facebook post. It was like, hey, I need help. This lady appears on there and then like basically writes this message like, hey, I need help. Here's what happened to me. And she described that one morning, a normal morning, she wakes up, she kind of notices little differences, but not enough to be just kind of completely alarmed right out of the gate. But she notices like, I don't remember putting these pajamas on last night, but they were pajamas that she owned. So, you know, maybe you know how it is. Some days you're just like, oh, I don't remember wearing this, but okay. Then little things like in her house were just slightly different. Like a table was, you know, a little bit a different shade of stain or something, or her carpet color was just like slightly different. And so again, she didn't really think much of it. She goes to work. She goes up to the floor that she's been working in the company and in the job that she's had for like 20 plus years, and she doesn't recognize a single coworker.
Yeah.
In other words, all strangers. And she's kind of
Man.
like, what is going on? And she realizes too that her job like description or whatever is not what she's been doing for the past 20 plus years. It'd be like, if your job was, I don't know, company executive, and you get there and they're like, company executive, no, you're
the janitor.
mailroom executive.
Yeah, right.
Something like that extreme. And she's just like puzzled. People are trying to like calm her down. They know her. They all know her. They're like, I don't remember the lady's name, Lorena, like, we know you. What's the problem? So she is just freaking out, right? And so she goes home. And when she gets home, her partner is waiting for her.
Mm-hmm.
And she sees the car in the driveway, and she's like, huh? She goes inside, and it's the boyfriend that she had broken up with like 6 months ago.
Man.
And so she's even more confused. She's like, what? And instead, the way she kind of, in her reality or how she remembers it, is she broke up with this guy 6 months ago. And then 2 months ago started dating this new guy who like had a son, lived down the street, all this stuff. So she's like telling this, old boyfriend, or the current, that happens in this reality to be her current boyfriend or whatever. Hey, just get out. So he's confused. He leaves. She calls the number of this guy that she had been dating. The person answers. They're like, I don't know who you're talking. It's a lady too. So she's like, you're hiding him, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me where he is. And she's like, ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry. You have the wrong number. So then she says, you know what? I'm going to march my butt over there and I'm going to go. She goes to this guy's house, knocking on the door. Bam, 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 bam. Hello. Whatever the guy's name was, a lady comes out. She's like, I think I just talked to you. There's no one here. She asked for like the guy's son. He knows me. I've been playing with him for 2 months, whatever. The lady's like, there's no son. I don't know what you're talking about.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of it. And so she's just flipping out. She goes back to her house. And unfortunately for her, man, like she never kind of snapped back to her reality. Cue the Eminem. Snap back to reality. And she's been quote unquote stuck here ever since. So it's just something that she's had to accept. So years go by, and finally she posts this story on this forum and says, please, can someone help me? Has anything like this ever happened to anyone? And as far as I know, man, nobody, obviously was able to help her. So it's just,
Yeah,
it's crazy, man.
Well, and being someone who, did experience whatever it was, maybe it was just some neurological thing that happened to me, but, it does kind of suck because there's such a stigma of we immediately rationalize and immediately go to, oh, this person's drunk, or maybe they're on drugs, or they don't know what they're talking about. They're just making this up to get attention or whatever. I think this thing is probably a little more common than not, but there is such a stigma attached that everybody just kind of keeps it to themselves. I mean, for me, when this first happened, I mean, I've always been a kid who was obsessed with, like I said, fringe stuff or paranormal, anything weird like this. But the idea of like time slips or missing time, at that time I'd never really even heard of it. I mean, I didn't really even know it was like a thing. So, I became obsessed and just went really, really heavy into it, just trying to figure out what happened. And is this like a normal thing? And
that's how you came across the Man From Taured.
That's how I came across the Man From Taured.
Man, I think that's an awesome place to wrap it up. I also want to say hello to a bunch of the new listeners that we've gotten this week from literally all around the world. I mean, we've got folks in Romania, Switzerland, Ireland, Australia, India, Mexico, and Austria.
That is so cool.
One of these days, we need to tell, especially our listeners in Australia, about the time that we were in
Good
some...
day there, mate. How the hell are you?
Oh, man. Two
Classic.
things. One, you have the worst Australian accent kind of imitation. And then second, that same terrible accent was used when we convinced these probably really inebriated people in some random town in the U.S. when we were on tour with our band that we were, in fact, from Australia. And the only reason we did... Well, I guess I'm telling the story now. The only reason we did is because they came up to us after we sound checked, and they're like, "Hey, are you guys from somewhere?" And I'm like, "I don't." They must have seen the confusion on my face, and they said, like England or Australia or something. And then you just like piped in with like, "Oh yeah, we are." Yeah. And they're like, "Huh?" And then I'm like, "Okay, I'm gonna go with it."
Here we go.
Here we go. And then. So you and I are like speaking to them like this with Australian accents, and we're like,
The whole night.
we're here from Australia, and boy, that was terrible too. And then like, I'm pretty sure like Boo Boo tried, and it just sounded like, what's his name, dude? Borat.
Yeah.
I mean, it was basically the equivalent. He's like, hello, and then Thomas was just like, I'm not doing that.
I'm not doing this. Which is probably the smartest move.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So that's it for today's episode. Thank you again so much. Until next week, be rad.
That's the way it goes.